presented by Jackson Pope, who is again in our program. And it's, well, as you see, we won't just have something to see, but also something to hear, I understand. So the floor is yours.
Let's give this a whirl.
Children could never hear the songs of birds, aside from the deafness, as we're going to hear them during the next few minutes. The actual songs of a number of species, recorded on discs and tape, from the library of the Albert R. Brand Birdsong Foundation in the Laboratory of Ornithology at Cornell University. Professor Peter P. Kellogg, Professor of Ornithology at Cornell, and his colleague, Professor A. Allen, very kindly allowed me to re-record some of the bird songs for broadcast on Broken Station and Music this afternoon. You'll hear familiar songs, but you'll hear also some strange and enchanting sounds.
So I do birds, and I'm going to do a few things in my talk here today. I want to convince you of the importance of bird watching as a shared community of practice, as a common culture that link ornithologists and casual birders at the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. I want to point to the importance of sound recording in this culture and the ways that forces us to rethink ideas about professionalization and separation between scientists and the public associated with narratives of the laboratory. I also want, time willing, to explain a bad joke on the way. So, today I'd like to discuss the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology and its relationship to the birdwatching community. Narratives of Laboratory Life has presented the laboratory as a professionalizing space that separates scientists and the public into different communities with no common ground. Implicit in this kind of narrative is the assumption that science communication or popularization exists as an attempt to bridge the gap between these two communities. However, the study of the Cornell Lab reveals a very different story. In this story, the laboratory is a space of collaboration and interaction with the public, not of separation. The lab had its origins in 1915 when Arthur Augustus Allen got his own office in the Department of Entomology at Cornell. However, during Allen's entire career, the lab existed as an aspiration rather than as an administrative reality within the structure of the university. It was a relationship that Allen and Peter Paul Kellogg, his former graduate student and later close colleague, formed with the larger community of birdwatchers that enabled the construction of the lab as a physical space in 1957 and ensured its survival as an institution. This relationship existed because Allen and Kellogg were birdwatchers themselves and formed a common community of practice, with them sharing a common language and skill set with thousands of recreational birdwatchers across the country. Thus, Allen's popularization activities, conducting birdwalks, summer classes, bird photography for National Geographic, were vital ways of linking the lab with this wider community and enabling it to access the economy of knowledge in which information about birds was shared and distributed. To illustrate how this knowledge economy worked and how the lab participated in it, I have chosen to focus on sound recording. Among all the activities the lab was involved with during the first phase of its existence, it is sound recording that most clearly illustrates the dependence the lab had upon birdwatchers. It was the lab's interaction with birdwatchers through the activity of sound recording that enabled Allen and Kellogg to turn the lab into a repository for natural sounds. At the same time, this interaction also reveals ways in which the lab was able to make itself useful to this community through the production of records that could be circulated through the network, who used them for aesthetic enjoyment and as a way to deepen the mastery of the skills of birdwatching by learning to identify birds by song when visual identification and field guides failed. The production of records was an important service that the lab rendered to this community because it greatly simplified the complexity associated with trying to learn bird songs. Both scientific ornithologists and casual bird watchers had a vested interest in this outcome. Previous to the development of these records, naturalists had experimented with various ways of representing bird song with systems of symbols, or even attempts to map bird songs onto a musical scale. And you can sort of see some of this here. So, this comes from a book that was written in 1904 by an amateur naturalist by the name of Friedrich Schuyler Matthews. He sort of worked with Frank Chapman at the American Museum of Natural History, and sort of his argument was that you could represent birdsong on a musical scale. but people using it after him found it pretty much gobbledygook and couldn't sort of figure it out. These are sort of systems of symbols that were used by Alan and developed for at the lab to sort of represent how birdsong sort of worked. And then there's these sort of phonetic representations that get used a lot at the lab itself, and they occur in the records. So these are sort of just phonetic phrases that you would hear and be able to memorize bird songs that get incorporated into the records later. So this here is supposed to represent a blackbird. You've heard of blackbird.
Well, the speaker may have gone off.
Ah. It's back. Okay. Connected. Do I have to pair it? There we go. Okay. So anyway, these systems of musical representation and symbols and even the use of these phonetic phrases were cumbersome. They were clunky and difficult to understand. The records offered the promise of simplicity and a knowledge of bird songs that was not mediated by cumbersome systems. The lab's Macaulay Library is now the preeminent library of natural sounds in the world. It achieved this position because Allen and Kellogg were able to convince others in the network to donate their recordings to the lab. The lab in turn turned these song donations into a public good in the form of records to the benefit of the entire birdwatching community, ornithologists and casual birders alike. However, I'd like to take a brief step back here to establish the context in which the Cornell Lab was born, and why it matters that Allen participated in the practice of birdwatching. Allen completed his education and began his teaching career at Cornell at a time of dramatic transition in ornithology. During the 19-teens and 20s, ornithology was beginning to embrace a new set of questions based upon migration, ethology, life studies, and ecology, which required an equally new set of practices. The 19th century was the era of shotgun ornithology. Ornithology in this period was concerned primarily with issues of taxonomy. Taxonomies were established through the use of keys, and keys presuppose a specimen in the hand, which were required by the use of guns. And I should explain what a key is. It's basically a set of questions that you have. So like, what's the bill look like? Is it elongated, short? And then you would have sort of like yes or no, and then sort of leads you on to the sort of next set of questions. That's how you establish the speciation of what the bird actually is. At the same time, there was an incredibly robust culture of amateur naturalism that engaged in the same sorts of collecting practices. They formed networks of exchange and correspondence using magazines such as the Ornithologist and Oologist, you can see that there, to trade specimens, share techniques, and engage in debates. The culture of collecting formed a common community of practice that linked together amateurs and professionals within ornithology. And you could sort of see that. My favorite example is this one where this guy says, I teach hypnotism and mesmerism by mail. Rent is reasonable, and for a short time I will accept desirable natural history specimens in Cambridge. This was an advertisement in the Osprey, and you can sort of see here is in the same issue, and I can't really read it, but you know, it's basically a bulletin board where people's like, I want eggs from burrowing owls, you know, I will exchange these other egg sets that I have. So there's this robust economy of exchange that's going on through these magazines. This culture collapsed in the early decades of the 20th century. Birdwatchers who had previously shared the same kinds of spaces with collectors, and you can sort of see this in the kind of the advertisements here, and this the American Bird magazine sort of had cameras and binoculars illustrated there, but there's also a lot of advertisements for guns that appear sort of throughout this period. And the ornithologists and oologists were sort of expressly set up as sort of a shared space between these two networks. However, birdwatchers became increasingly hostile to the practices associated with collecting. 1886 saw the foundation of the Audubon Society, which mobilized the conservationist conscious public in support of bird protection. In popular literature, the figure of the collector began to appear as a kind of villain, and collecting itself a marker of dubious moral quality. The passage of the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918 capped this process by making it illegal to kill or transport migratory birds. This and other state and local statutes effectively destroyed the economy of exchange that had undergirded amateur collecting. The collapse of the culture of collecting, which had linked professional and amateur collectors, was replaced by a new community of bird watching with a new set of practices and tools. Allen was very much a part of this transition. His 1911 dissertation entitled Red-Winged Blackbird, a study of the ecology of a cattail marsh, was considered an instant classic in the field of ecology. He would later go on to work for Frank Chapman at the American Museum of Natural History. Chapman himself was an avid bird watcher and editor of Bird Lore, the magazine of the Audubon Society. Allen's first graduate student was Ludlow Griscom, known as the Dean of the Bird Watchers, who would go on to mentor an influential group of young bird watchers in New York, including Roger Tory Peterson, who published his famous guide in 1934. Sound recordings of birdsong had been conducted prior to the work of the Cornell Lab. However, these recordings of captive birds were problematic because, with the exception of a few birds, such as the canary, most birds do not sing normally in captivity. It was the wildness which was prominently advertised in the Cornell records that gave them value for the purposes of fieldwork and recreational enjoyment. Arthur Allen and Peter Paul Kellogg initiated the sound recording at Cornell, and they were able to record the songs of birds in Ithaca Park in 1929. This experiment was conducted on behalf of the Fox Case Movietone Corporation, who wanted Allen's assistance to test a new technological innovation, motion pictures with synchronized sound. The next few years witnessed a period of experimentation with technologies and techniques, particularly under another one of Allen's graduate students, Albert R. Brand, and you can see him pictured here, who had quit his job at the New York Stock Exchange and came to Cornell to study birds under Allen. Along with Peter Keene, a Cornell undergraduate, and True McLean, a professor of engineering at Cornell, they worked to develop suitable technologies to record wild bird songs. One of the most important innovations was made by the lab team was the development of a parabolic reflector microphone system with the repurposing of old World War I equipment. And that's the sort of device that he's using there. Ask me about it later, it's interesting. In the 1930s, the technology had become sophisticated enough that Brand was able to achieve good enough records that he released the first of his commercial record books, Songs of Wild Birds, in 1934. That's the one sort of pictured here. More Songs of Wild Birds in 1936, and American Bird Songs in 1940. In 1935, Allen and Kellogg went on an expedition across the United States to film and record birds. One of the most significant aspects of the expedition was the recording of the ivory-billed woodpecker in Louisiana, a species which is feared extinct today. It was in the 1950s that Kellogg's ambition to turn the lab into an important natural sound library received from Expression. In an article about recording sounds in nature, Kellogg outlined his plans for the creation of this library, remarking that Cornell University, as a result of 35 years of natural history recording, has a large collection of sound recordings that could serve as a basis for this kind of library. But it is hoped that others doing field recording would wish to store copies of the recordings in the library. This procedure would automatically make their work more widely useful and would go on to provide a degree of permanence and a workable system of preservation and use not ordinarily available to such material. Ownership protection would be given to the respective contributions of recorded material. Users of the material would understand that the primary purpose of the collection was for scientific study, and the material might not be used commercially in any manner, whether for radio, television, motion pictures, or as illustrated material in public lectures, without written permission from the owner of the original recording. However, when the library became a reality, there was one important modification. The ownership of recorded material was given over to the Cornell Lab upon donation. So now I would like to turn to examining the network itself and the people that Kellogg and Allen came to rely upon, how information was shared within the network. And I would like, as far as in my power to do so, to have you understand this network on an experiential level by moving through it. And I did that as I was attempting to gild the lily of my talk last night by, as you can see, this incredibly amazing map that I made using MS Paint last year.
Yes.
To do that, we're going to have to take a little road trip with Norma and Jerry Stillwell and follow them as they journey across the United States recording bird songs. Stillwells began their adventure in song recording in 1948 by accident, after trying to record songs from the radio and picking up the song of a mockingbird. They were already avid and well-connected bird watchers, and they began to share their recordings with friends. They were also motivated because Brand's record had comparatively few western birds that were represented. The existence of a network of bird watchers was vital in allowing the Stillwells to conduct their journey. By the 1940s, recreational bird watching had created an important knowledge economy based around the exchange of information about good places to find birds. This economy arose out of and eventually displaced an older economy of amateur collecting as the interests of collectors and bird watchers became antithetical. Collectors were frozen out of this network and were not privy to the sorts of information that bird watchers shared among themselves. Basically, collectors weren't invited to bird watching parties. In December of 1948, the Stillwells sold their house, bought a trailer, and hit the road, eventually ending up in Harlingen, Texas, at the home of some birding friends, including L. Irby Davis, a well-known Texas birder with considerable expertise in the birds of the American Southwest and Mexico. In 1940, and had created the Santa Ana Range Refuge. In 1946, Arthur Allen had gone through Harlingen on his way to Mexico on assignment from the National Geographic Society to photograph and record Mexican bird songs. Allen sought Davis's advice on the best birding locations in Mexico, and they quickly became friends. Davis would go on to begin recording Mexican birds himself in 1950, which resulted in the first of the lab-sponsored record publications, The Voices of Mexican Birds, in 1958.
Now, from the humid cloud forest come the incomparable melodies of the slate-colored solitaire, or clarino.
In 1950, the Stillwells were down in Florida, paying an extended visit with Peter Paul Kellogg. As an example of the local knowledge the Stillwells relied upon on their journey, we can look at the 1951 and 53 works of the ornithologist Owen Sewell Pettengill Jr., who was a former graduate student of Allen's, who would eventually become the director of the lab. Pettengill's guide to finding birds of the East and West were the result of the collaboration of hundreds of bird watchers. To create these guides which showcase local knowledge for state-by-state descriptions of the best places to find birds. And I sort of did this last night. This is sort of one of the descriptions that he has. Basically, in Bozeman, Montana, my neck of the woods, you go to the Federal Fish Hatchery, you look for the big M, and then you drive in there, and then you look for this grassy knoll here. Sort of that's what that looks like. And there's an incredibly detailed description of it in the book. Throughout this part of the early part of their recording career, the Stillwells have been plagued with technological difficulties that impacted the quality of the recordings. The 2-week working vacation where Jerry Stillwell and Kellogg worked together to improve their equipment marks an important turning point for both parties. Kellogg's technical advice and access to resources vastly improved the quality of the recordings the Stillwells were able to achieve. Better quality commercial records better quality recordings meant, apart from their aesthetic enjoyment, that the Stillwells would be able to make commercial records of their own. From Kellogg's point of view, high quality recordings were absolutely essential for the purposes of the sound library. Kellogg's assistance to the Stillwells eventually paid off when Norman donated their entire collection to the library, encompassing thousands of recordings, many from the western parts of the United States. During 1953 recording season, the Stillwells passed through Ithaca, visiting with the families of Allen and Kellogg just as the construction was beginning on the new lab. The start of 1955 found Jerry working with Davis and Harlingen to copy the best of his Mexican bird songs, which would eventually be used in the first Cornell-sponsored record series. As the experience of the Stillwells demonstrates, this network of bird watchers was incredibly dense and well-connected. It also undergirded the science of ornithology, both by providing ornithologists with fundamental skills of their field-oriented craft, but also by creating a community which could support them in their scientific work by applying their skills as bird watchers. The lab itself was a creation of this network. Quite literally, it was the result of a gift from Lyman K. Stewart, a wealthy oil man who had wanted Allen's assistance to take photos of birds. After winning a photo contest in Life magazine, Stewart purchased the land upon which the lab was built. The selection of the location of the lab, Sapsucker Woods, was also a reflection of the deep tie the lab had to bird watching. Rather than being in a hall at Cornell University, it was in the woods where Allen had spent his time watching birds as a young man. Finally, the sound library itself, created by the donations of dedicated bird watchers, helped crystallize the lab as a corporate body through the ownership of those songs and the production of records based upon them. So this is from the record
There is
Odening
a charming
in
spot in
Sapsucker.
the Lakes country of central New York that we know as Sapsucker Woods. Friends have given it to Cornell University to be set aside in perpetuity as a bird sanctuary. At its northern border is a woody pond where the waterfowl vie with the frogs and toads to make the nights musical and interesting. We call it Sapsucker Woods because here the yellow-bellied sapsucker finds a place sufficiently cool to satisfy its Canadian urge and sound its irregular Morse code and rear its young south of its normal range.
Here's some pictures of owls. Questions? I should say, if you'll permit me, I will explain the bad joke. So the title of the thing is Collecting the Sounds of Nature. It's a sort of a threefold joke in that it's sound recording, but it also refers to the residual nature of collecting culture that sort of survived through the process of sound recording. It also refers to my own process of collecting the Cornell record series, The Sounds of Nature, which I had been working on since the summer to sort of digitize, for some reason looking at that, to digitize the collection, which is why you can hear them here. So this is the archive sort of that I'm working with. There's sort of 19 things on there. More things are being put up. Audio, images, and text will be all up there.
There are some questions.
Blair.
Who was, like, I get that these were commercial records. Was this like bird watchers who were buying these for fun, or was there a market for like white noise bird sounds in their home?
That's a
Who bought them? Who was the market?
Birders, primarily. And there's also interesting, some of the records that I haven't digitized yet are like records that you buy to train your bird, like parakeets to sing. Like, that was a thing. There's a whole bunch of records from the 50s that do that. And there's also, if maybe I can sort of sample it if I see it here. It's called The Bird Fancier's Delight, which is what's the next page? Which is basically a recreation, a record recreation of a 17, there we go, Bird Fancier's Delight. Okay, so like inevitably when we want to show this off.